Hi everyone, let's get started. So this live stream is going to be about showing that you've risen to the top of your field, and I think it's the misunderstanding of what this actually means that drives a lot of low quality profile building and leads to just activities that don't make sense for people's profiles. So let's go back to what it means to rise to the top of your field. A lot of people think that it means to show that they fit some sort of archetype that USCIS definitely has in regards to what their profile should look like, that there's some sort of rubric that is followed for each field, that you have to look a certain way to have your profile count towards this sort of evidentiary standard, but the reality is that is not the case. What is probably going to be the case is that the officer will not have worked in your field and will therefore not really have this archetype in mind, that there's no rubric as well that they follow in regards to what your profile should look like. And as a result, you don't really, there's no archetype that once you follow will automatically mean that you're risen to the top of your field. How you should be thinking about how you've risen to the top of your field is in thinking about how your profile makes sense to someone else in your field, and also someone who's never worked in your field. What you want to focus on is really just the strength of your argument that you've risen to the top of your field. And how you make that argument is through a narrative, a case narrative. So you have to tell the story of how you are now at the top of your field, and how you can do that is by showing progression, a continual thread of expertise, perhaps starting with your first few years in your industry and slowly accumulating a record of significant outcomes for maybe several top US companies, for several top companies in general, maybe outside of the US. You have to show this continuity, and that's one element of showing how you've risen to the top of your field, that you have just continued to compound the outcomes you have created through your work. So that is one way to show that you've risen to the top of your field. And then you also want to show comparative significance, especially comparative significance of your work. And that comes from building the contextual narrative around what you've done. So if what you've done is so outstanding, you have to be able to establish that through not just explaining your work in regards to how it compares to other work in your field, other similar work, but also through reference letters that don't just make these affirmative statements about your work, but actually provide the context that's needed. For example, if you recruit an expert to talk about your work, they could say, I have 20 years or 30 years of experience in this field, and I have never seen this kind of work being done in this certain way, and that is why this person has risen to the top of their field. That could count as evidence in itself. And that is how you want to establish that you've risen to the top of your field. So notice that I didn't say certain things like do certain activities or fit some sort of archetype or check this box and you're automatically going to show that you've risen to the top of your field. It is not about that. It is about having a case narrative that makes sense, not just to people in your field, but also people who have never worked in your field who can, by unpacking your argument, understand how it is that you've risen to the top of your field on a comparative level, on a relative level. That is what you want to be showing. So I think that should clear up a lot of misconceptions about how to build this argument. One of the most common misconceptions, I think, is to force a niche to identify some really narrow field that may actually have nothing to do or may only be tangentially related to your work. And then saying that, oh, because I defined my field in such a narrow way, therefore I must have been able to show that I've risen to the top of my field. But if you don't make that argument properly, what is probably going to end up happening is you're going to be producing a very unnatural narrative, a very unnatural profile, sort of like shoehorning things into like something that you know that doesn't fit you, but you think that it is what needs to be done. It's the archetype you need to follow. It's the niche you need to carve out. And then what you end up doing is doing a bunch of random, unnatural activities to force yourself into a niche. And I think that is what leads to very unnatural profiles that most likely will get denied on final merits. A lot of people they keep relying on this niche sort of mentality, like I need to make things super narrow, and as a result, I'll be able to show, because of this really small subset, I'll be able to show that I've risen to the top of my field. And for some people, it might work because they actually have a really strong niche. They've always worked in this niche, and this usually applies to, say, very deep technical experts. But outside of that, if you work, say, in multiple companies, or you work, say, at a FANG, and then you're, I don't know, like a director of product or something like that, you can still niche down. It's just when you niche down, just make sure it actually makes sense for your profile, and you're not just trying to force activities and include things that you think will automatically make you outstanding to an officer. It's really about the strength of your narrative and whether your argument actually makes sense. That's going to be a big part. Can someone who's never worked in your field understand your argument? That is another thing when it comes to your profile. That is what you need to be showing. It's not as much about showing that you've risen to the top of your field, because a lot of you have actually risen to the top of your field. It's more about explaining how it is that someone who is not in your field would be able to understand that you've risen to the top of your field. So yeah, that is what I wanted to say about this topic. Anyone have questions, feel free to add them. Feel free to leave them in the comments and I will answer them. Anyone have questions? So yeah, for those of you who are joining, just wanted to recap that it is about explaining well how it is you have risen to the top of your field to someone who's never worked in your field, which is going to be the officer. How well you do that explaining is going to determine the strength of your profile. If you do not explain that well, there is nothing to really evaluate. Say you're like a very accomplished director of product or director of engineering, but you just keep saying you are a top director of engineering without any sort of context, any sort of claims, subclaims. How would someone who has never worked in your field be able to understand that you've risen to the top of your field? Because they've never worked in your field, so how would they know? They don't carry the same assumptions you do. So if they don't carry those assumptions, they're not going to understand your argument if you don't present it well. That's really what it is. Is there a requirement for the niche? Can it be generic like software engineering? So my point was, you don't really need a niche if you don't have a niche. It's more about presenting a strong and compelling narrative that makes sense. If you do not have a compelling narrative, if you aren't able to illustrate the comparative significance of your work, if you're not able to explain the assumptions that you carry into assessing your own argument, and because someone in your field, a bunch of really top professionals in your field could say, you have risen to the top of your field. We do agree with your assessment. But you show that to someone who has never worked in your field, they may not understand your argument at all, and as a result, not be able to understand how you've risen to the top of your field. And if you can't prove it, then it's not going to be accepted, which means you're going to get denied. You're going to get denied. So I avoid that is by breaking things down, simplifying things, providing a lot of context, providing different angles to your arguments, different angles to your profile. Those reviewing papers qualify as sufficient evidence to meet the judging criteria for EB-1A. Yes, but the problem with just reviewing papers as an industry professional is that usually it is evidence of industry, evidence of research recognition, and not really industry recognition. So if you're not showing industry recognition as an industry professional, you're not really helping with final merits and in strengthening your argument that you've risen to the top of your field. So yes, it can count towards judging. It's just, you should have more than just peer review if you want it to count towards final merit, as in judging evidence. Any other questions? But yeah, going to another point, if you can only show research recognition with no industry recognition, external recognition especially, you are probably going to get questioned on final merits because you haven't really shown how you have risen to the top of your field. So let's say you are a top industry professional and you claim you have risen to the top of your field. So then you go author a bunch of papers in academic journals and you review a bunch of papers for academic journals. You can only present external recognition for researchers. That's how you're going to get questioned. You claim you're a top industry professional, but it seems like all these other top industry professionals in your industry, they all have, say you're a software engineer, hackathon judging or demo day judging, or they've spoken at these conferences, and you've shown absolutely no external recognition from people outside of your company. How can you then claim that you've risen to the top of your field? That is how you're going to get questioned. And if that is how you get questioned, what is going to be your answer to those questions? That, oh no, I'm recognized by researchers? If you don't work with researchers, if you're not a research professional, then it's just not going to make sense. And if your argument doesn't make sense, and you're questioned through an RFE, how do you expect to respond to that RFE? A lot of you also do a lot of questionable things, questionable in the sense that you do things that don't make sense for your profile. So there's just like, for example, over focus on papers and peer reviewing for industry professionals. How are you being recognized as an industry professional by contributing to an academic journal that's just for researchers? That's a question I ask all the time as well. Hadwait asks, what are some examples of software engineering rising to the field would look like for industry professionals? Sure. So for example, say director of engineering has produced significant outcomes for several top US companies, driven millions, probably even hundreds of millions in revenue for a bunch of top companies. And they have been recognized through judging and authorship. They published like 1 to 2 trade publication articles that talk about their expertise and their work that they have done through leading a critical role. They have also done a lot of judging, like hackathons and demo days, and even perhaps reviewing for conferences, reviewing speaker proposals. And they were included in those opportunities because of their industry expertise. And then speaking, they've spoken at a couple of conferences, 1 or 2, and they were invited for their industry expertise. That would be a strong profile, even though that's just 3 to 4 criteria. That would be considered a strong profile for a software engineer. Also, it's not about rising to the top of your field, it is having risen to the top of your field. You have to show that you have risen to the top of your field. That is another core aspect of the narrative that is not really captured well. I think people don't understand the difference between rising to the top of their field and have already risen. Rising to the top of your field is not the EB-1A standard. You can't show that you're about to be in the top 1 to 3%. You have to show that you are already in the top 1 to 3%, because it's having risen to the top of your field. And then how you build your argument around that is what determines the strength of your profile. Any other questions? So we can talk a bit about final merits as well. Final merits simply means the strength of your argument and your argument of how you have risen to the top of your field. That argument is usually based on how well you explain how you've risen to the top of your field. If you're unable to explain that, it doesn't matter if you've actually risen to the top of your field, you will probably get denied. Because your job is to show to someone who's never worked in your field how you've risen to the top of your field. If you're unable to show that, then no one's going to understand your argument. So being able to explain how it is that you've risen to the top of your field is, I think it's a neglected part of profile building. People just want to cram as much evidence in as possible, but they don't really understand how they are constructing a narrative for how they've risen to the top of their field. So they end up with a bunch of random evidence, a lot of which sticks out, and then they get questioned on RFEs, and then sometimes they get denied, sometimes they get approved, but it's still. And I'm only saying this because I've spoken to people who've only claimed 3 criteria and got approved. For example, I spoke to someone who speaks some pretty regularly a couple months ago, and he got approved while on OPT. He got approved for EB-1A while on OPT, and what happened with him was he showed continual progression in his 6 years of experience, from his master's studies all the way up to then creating some sort of ML model that changed government regulations. Now, he only claimed 4 criteria, but he didn't really claim the 4th one because he knew he wouldn't get granted, but he just kind of like still claimed it. So he used his master's thesis for authorship, which is not what you want to be doing for authorship, but he just kind of claimed 3 criteria. He got RFE'd, but he still got approved. And how he did it was he explained really well how it was that he had risen to the top of his field already through his work. He broke things down, simplified things, made sure the layperson would be able to understand his argument, the significance of his work, the wider significance and relevance of his work, and then he got approved. And that was because he was able to simplify things to such a degree that the officer was able to follow his argument and understand how he had risen to the top of his field already. Creedy asks, if I have given 3 to 4 industry talks to startups and other venues, would that count towards authorship evidence? What would be the best place to include them? I'm applying for O-1A visa. Industry talks, probably not authorship. Depends if they were published anywhere, as in publications, but generally speaking, no. They can still help with fund merits, though, in that if you were able to demonstrate expertise through these talks, you were invited to these talks, why you were invited, explaining these things, and again, everything has to be on a layperson level. If a layperson isn't able to understand the wider significance of these talks, then there's really no point in including them. So you have to be able to capture that as well in your explanations. Does reviewing conference papers satisfy? Yes, it does help with peer reviewing, which is a form of judging. It's just that if you just review papers, you could get granted the judging criterion, but still not be able to strengthen fund merits with your judging. So it really depends on whether you want to strengthen judging through paper reviewing. If not, then review papers and just get judging. Can you please give examples that constitute a person risen to the top of the field in AI? Yes, one example is, well, that example I just explained. This person was able to get approved while on OPT, and he got approved because his AI model was able to change Medicare. So he was able to create such a shift in government policy, and other US companies followed suit in using his model to encourage the government to change Medicare. That's quite significant because of the wider significance and massive impact of his work. Are speaking opportunities must to prove that a person reached the top of their field? No, because this person, like just to give you an example, this person did not have any speaking opportunity and he was still approved. Speaking is a way to strengthen your argument. It is not the only way. What are some good examples of standing publications, the trade publications that can count towards authorship for AI field? How do you cement? They are reputed places outside of visitor count, include in letters of reference. Examples are InfoQ, Lead Dev, Towards Data Science is decent. Visitor count has nothing to do. Visitor count has absolutely nothing to do with whether these publications count. Again, that's another misconception. I have no idea where it came from. I guess it's just a convenient number to measure. But you could have millions of people visiting the website from who don't even have the background that you have. So how are you supposed to show that you've risen to the top of your field if you just have a bunch of random people visiting a website and you're saying, hey, this is like an example of an industry publication? Absolutely not. What you want to be doing is media kits. You want to be looking at media kits and seeing if this publication actually describes the demographics and numbers when it comes to these demographics. So for example, Lead Dev has strong numbers. They show who actually visits the website and reads the publications. they say it's engineering managers mostly, over 50,000 from many different countries, from many different companies. They're able to show these numbers, these specific numbers and context around these numbers. It's not visitor count. Avinash asks, what is the role of reference letters to prove that a person has risen to the top of the field, and how would they explain it? Well, reference letters are they're actually forms of evidence. So if you made a claim that, say, this project is top 1%, if you get an industry expert who has 40 years of experience in the field to say, yes, this actually is a top 1% project because of this, and this impact is verified, that is actually affirming your argument, part of your argument that you've risen to the top of your field. Now, saying you produce a significant outcome is, of course, a sub-argument for how you've risen to the top of your field, and getting a top industry expert to affirm it is in itself additional evidence to back up the same claim. So that's one way. And the other way is context, providing wider context around your work. So this is like top 1%. How do we know it's top 1%? Well, if we look at all these other projects in the same vein, this Avinash's project is top 1% because it outperforms in this particular metric. And given that I am a CEO with 40 years of experience, yes, I do agree with Avinash's assessment. That in itself is evidence. That's a testimonial to your claim. That's how it would help with your profile. What you don't want in a reference letter is, hey, Avinash is really good at his role or something like that. That has nothing to do with providing context and strengthening your claims. Does EB-2NW help EB-1A? It helps in that you actually get to learn more about profile building in general, but other than that, no. Regarding the EB-1A award criterion, do awards need to be recognized in competitive in nature, or would purchase of participation-based awards also count? How do adjudicators generally view such awards? Awards is one of the most highly questioned criterion ever. I believe it's one of, along with media coverage, gets questioned all the time. I have no idea why people go for it. If you understand how EB-1A cases are strengthened and produced, then you'll realize that awards is probably one of the worst criterion to try to target. There's so few industry awards, and those usually go to very top leaders. And most of the awards that I've been seeing have no industry recognition whatsoever. They're self-contained. People only know them because they themselves talk about these awards. It's just not something you should go for. And no, purchased awards definitely do not count. Speaking at conferences as a panelist, would that count in one of the criteria? And if that happens for multiple conferences, it helps with final merits. Could help with leading a critical role if you are talking about, if you're showcasing your expertise as a top expert in your field, but most likely final merits. What if one can't get a letter from the company for the original contribution? Example, Google secret project. Then the thing is, if it's an original contribution, then you have contributed to your field and it's being used by other top companies. So if that's private in any way, then you're going to have a really hard time showing the wider significance of your original contributions because no one knows about the wider significance. So maybe you can have some sort of reference letter that hints at the fact that you worked on this kind of original technology without giving away particular details. Also, the focus is not on the specific project. That's another thing. People love to focus on the technical details of their work, but they don't actually focus on how to explain those technical details. You need to explain those details in order for your argument to be strengthened. If you don't explain those details, all those technical details have nothing to do with EB-1A. So it's just, I think this question is potentially problematic in itself because you should be focusing on impact, not on the nature of your project. I mean, there's an angle to this where you can focus on the nature of your project as a way to demonstrate your technical expertise, but the problem with that, again, is you're focusing on the details and you're not focusing on the significance or impact. I mean, like, I don't really understand how talking about impact would give away the details of the project or proprietary information. Probably not. And you can just make the impact very general and get some sort of expert to affirm, probably an expert as in someone at your company, to affirm that you actually delivered on this impact. Probably not going to get an independent reference for a confidential project, but you probably could get one from a company leader who talks about the impact you have created, or at least provides the context for someone who is not in your field to understand the wider significance and comparatively significant nature of your work. Notice that you can do that without revealing any sort of details whatsoever. Anyone else have questions? Anyone have questions? Also, a lot of you are focusing on reference letters too early on in the process. Your focus should be on profile building, not on reference letters, not on AO decisions, not on any of that. Many professional associations like IEEE or PMI require a fee to join. Would such memberships qualify, or does USCIS expect memberships that are based on outstanding achievements and selective admission? Again, the membership criterion is completely misunderstood. Requiring a fee to join is completely fine. IEEE fellowship, which definitely counts towards the membership criterion, also has a fee. It's not about whether the membership requires a fee or not. It's whether the membership requires outstanding achievements of its members as evaluated by nationally recognized or internationally recognized experts. Now, how you define outstanding achievements is the difficult part of membership because it really means anything you want it to mean. As in, the officer could have one view, you could have another, and then if they clash, then you don't get granted membership. IEEE membership general definitely doesn't count because it's not a requirement to have outstanding achievements. You can just join by paying the fee. That definitely doesn't count. Fellowship counts because you definitely do need outstanding achievements, and it is possible to build an argument around that. So does something like a board position at a top company, something like that. But membership is just difficult to meet in general. That being said, membership can still help with on merits if you have the right memberships. Also, it's not just about joining organizations. It can be committee positions. It could be ambassador programs or industry advisory boards. It doesn't have to be joining a professional organization. Can I use pending patents? No. Patent has been completed, implemented, and used across teams, but it has not been awarded yet. Probably not. It should be granted. That being said, you can use whatever you've done as leading or critical role evidence because seems like the work has been implemented and used across teams. I would be included in press releases of vendor companies. It should be about you or your work. It still could be leading a critical role. I don't understand why people like to go for the media coverage criteria. You're essentially just inviting more questions around your profile by claiming more criteria. The more criteria you claim, the more questions you're going to have to answer, especially if you do a low-quality job of claiming the criteria, which is what I see all the time. People trying to cram as much low-quality evidence in as possible to try to meet 8 criteria, and then they get granted all 8, and then they get denied on final merits. I've seen this all the time. Yeah. All right, I'll take a couple more questions. All right, last question. I have 8 years of experience in IT, and I currently play a critical role at a Fortune 100 company. However, I don't yet have have evidence to satisfy the judging criterion for EB-1A. What steps should I take to strengthen my case for both authorship and membership, authorship and judging? For example, can I publish papers or participate in conference paper reviews? Would these activities be sufficient? So no, these activities would probably just help you with the plain language level of the criteria for judging and authorship. So you could get granted judging or authorship, but it probably won't help with final merits unless you're some sort of research professional as well. What you are suggesting is what everyone defaults to for some reason. Everyone loves to default to publishing papers and peer reviewing for conferences, and then they're like, why did I get questioned on final merits? Well, it's because you showed absolutely no external recognition within your field whatsoever, because all the recognition you've gotten has been from researchers and not from industry professionals. So they would be sufficient for getting you judging and authorship as plain language level criteria, but outside of that, you are going to be heavily reliant on your linear and critical role for final merits. So sufficient for the criteria, yes. Sufficient for final merits, absolutely not. Because it goes back to this idea of final merits is about whether you've risen to the top of your field. If you have risen to the top of your field in industry, the officer is going to see other examples and see that people in your field generally have industry recognition, not research recognition. So they're going to use that against you, and then you're going to get denied on final merits, most likely. That is unless you can show a really strong linear and critical role, in which case it might not matter. You can just use linear and critical role to drive final merits. But let's say you don't really have that strong of a linear and critical role. You're not like the CEO of a company. You're not like some director of product like a FANG or something like that. Then you probably will get questioned on final merits. And that is something you definitely want to avoid. So I would suggest looking at industry-related activities as well, in addition to whatever peer reviewing and publishing papers, if you really, really want to do those things. All right, any other questions? All right. Thanks everyone for joining today's live stream.